Today is February 23rd, and we are going to be looking at more slope-intercept form today. We're going to analyze linear data to determine the best solution by organizing our data into tables and graphing them. Our real-world situation that we're looking at is a dance party. So as president of the school dance committee, one of your duties is to choose the DJ for the last dance of the year. You have called several local DJ companies and have narrowed down the field to your top 3 possibilities. We have Ted's Tunes, who charges $60 an hour. We have Funky Town, who charges $100 for setup plus $40 an hour. And Steven Solid Sounds, that charges $175 for equipment and $30 for an hour. Just by looking at this information here, I would like a show of hands of who thinks Steven Solid Sounds is going to be the best deal out there. Who thinks Ted Tunes is going to be the best deal? And how about Funky Town? Okay, so we've got a few from each of them because we're not quite sure what it's going to look like just yet. But I'm going to show you the process that we're going to take in these situations to figure out essentially which one is the best deal. The first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to write an equation for each company that represents the relationship between the cost of each company and the number of hours that the DJ plays. So this is exactly like what we did yesterday. So for Ted's Tunes that charges $60 an hour, please raise your hand and tell me what the equation of that's going to look like. Good. Y equals 60x. Why don't we have a plus or minus something there? There's no other number. There's no additional charge. So where is this graph going to cross the y-axis at? 0. Good. Funky Town charges $100 for setup fees plus $40 an hour. Raise your hand and tell me what that equation is going to look like. Don't forget your y equals. Y equals 40x plus 100 is correct. And Steven Solid Sounds charges $175 for equipment and $30 an hour. Good. Y equals 30x plus 175. So make sure you have these 3 equations down in your notes at this time because we're going to be using them for our next part. How do you know which one to put first? This is $40 per hour. So we know that we are multiplying that by a variable because we don't know how many hours that is. And since it's in slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b, we want to put our x term first. Okay, we have a table here. So we're going to make a table showing the cost of the 3 companies for 0 to 10 hours. We have the equations written down for each of the 3 companies. Ted Tunes is y equals 60x, Funky Town y equals 40x plus 100, and Steven Solid Sounds y equals 30x plus 175. I would like for you to take a moment to copy down the table and put the values in that belong in the table. Now, before we can put the values in, we have to know what we're plugging in and where we're plugging it in at. Raise your hand and tell me, what does x represent in this equation? The time or the hours. So when you have the number of hours over here, that's what you're going to plug in for x to get what the cost is or what y equals. Okay, now that we've had a chance to fill in our table, let's see what's behind the shades here. So for Ted's Tunes, for 1 hour it costs, for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, and 10 hours. 600. Okay, so far, how many of you still say that Ted's Tunes is going to be the best? Just a couple of us? Okay, let's look at Funky Town. For 1 hour, how much is Funky Town going to cost? 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, ooh, 260. 5 hours, 6 hours, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, now for Steven Solid Sounds, 1 hour, 205, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, and 10 hours. Okay. Now let's take a look at this table and kind of analyze it a little bit. Is there one company that by far is better than the other two? I hear a yes, I hear a no. Aha. Depends upon how many hours you want to use them for. So, if we only wanted the DJ for an hour, obviously Ted's Tunes is going to be the best deal. Now, if we were going to pay for 10 hours, like a dance marathon, then Steven Solid Sounds would be our best deal. So it depends upon the number of hours. That goes back to, I believe, a question that one of us had during our homework check about how they both kind of looked the same. But it all depends upon how many hours you're going to be using them for. So let's look at answering a couple of questions based upon that information. Oh, before we do that, let's graph them, okay? Let's graph these 3 companies. I'm going to close that out for just a second. And actually, I would like to have, there we go, so I can see what we're doing. The x-axis we said represents what? The number of hours. So down here we've got the number of hours. And the y-axis represents the money, the total cost. Okay, so for the hours, I'm going to come in here and say that here is 1 hour, 2 hours. I'm going to spread it out a little bit to make our graph a little more readable. Make sure you're putting the graph in your notes also, please. Okay, so we've gone from 1 to 10 hours. I didn't put 0 on here because we're not going to obviously be buying time for 0 amount of hours. The black lines are my x and y axis. It doesn't matter. That's just how I drew it. Okay, and then over here on the side, we need to go from 0 to $600, which is going to be kind of tough. We could put a break in the graph and start at $60, right? I'm not going to do it by 100 because if we look at our table, we've got lots of numbers that are in between, right? So I think this time I'm going to put a break in the graph and we're going to start at 60. But remember when you do that, that you need to do the little squiggly thing, okay? So if we start here at 60, let's go, um, let's count by 40s. See how that works out. So if this is 60, this would be 100, 140, 180, 210, 250, 290, 180 plus 40. I apologize. Okay, so that worked out pretty nice to where we've got all of our numbers that we need in there. Now, we're not going to have to plot every single point. Okay, we can use our slope-intercept form to plot it, or we can use our graph to plot a few of the points. So if we look at our graph here, for 1 hour, Ted's tunes cost $60. So we know at 1 hour, Ted is going to cost $60. Let's go over to 3 hours. Ted's going to cost $180. And then at 6 hours, Ted's going to cost $360. Do I have $360 on here? It's in between $340 and let's see if that's $340. Okay. And then at 9 hours, I've got a $540 up here. Okay, we can obviously see that this is what type of correlation? A positive correlation. If I had had 0 on my graph, we would see that it would go through 0 on the y-axis, but because I started at 60, that's where I'm starting at. Okay, so here's Ted's Tunes. I've got him in purple. Let's go ahead and look at Funky Town. So for 1 hour, Funky Town is at 140. Let's do 3 hours. 3 hours is 220. And 6 hours is 340. And 9 hours is 460. Or let's use 10 hours at 500. 10 hours at 500 here. I've got Funky Town in orange so that I've got different colors representing the different companies. Okay, what do we notice happening so far? Even just with these two. What's happening to them? They're both positive, but what else is happening? They're intersecting. Good. They're intersecting at about where? You can tell from the graph and from our table. At 6 hours, no, not at 6 hours, at 5 hours here. So at 5 hours, you can see that they are 300. So they're intersecting right there where they're both at $300 for 5 hours. What do you notice though? As Ted's Tunes goes up higher, what happens to his cost? What's happening to the cost up here? It's going up, right? Ted's Tunes is costing more than Funky Town. I've got them in two different colors. Funky Town is below Ted's Tunes. Now, on the left-hand side of our graph, Funky Town is above Ted's Tunes. So that means that Funky Town, the lower we are for the hours, costs more. The higher in the hours we are, costs less. So that's something that our graph can show us as well. Let's go ahead and graph Steven Solid Sounds. I've got him in green over here. So we'll do the same. For 1 hour is about 205. I don't have that over here on my scale though, so let's look at one that we do have. Maybe about 4 hours is 295. That's close to 300. So if we go over here to 4 hours, close to 300 here. And then we've got, let's see, I have 7 hours, 385, so I can go right above 380. And then I guess we'll have to do 475, 10 hours for 475. All right, and then we'll put our green line on here. Now we've got 3 different colors to choose from. We've got Ted's Tunes that's in purple. We have Funky Town that's in orange. And we have Steven Solid Sounds that's in green. Notice on the left-hand side of our graph, Ted's Tunes is the lowest costing. Funky Town is the middle, and Steven's is the highest. Now, after we hit this breaking point or this intersection where they're crossing each other, everything changes. Now, Steven Solid Sounds is the best deal. Funky Town is still in the middle, and Ted's Tunes is the highest costing. So once again, it proves our point that it just depends upon how many hours we're going to use their services for. So now after looking at the table, graphing the data and looking at it as a picture, let's go ahead and answer a few questions. First one, what information does the coefficient of x represent in each equation? So that number that's in front of x, the coefficient, what does it represent? Not the number of hours, that's x. What does the number in front of x represent? The, the cost per hour, right? What else does it represent? Exactly, it represents the slope. So it represents the slope, or we could say that it represents the cost per hour. Now, what information does the y-intercept represent in each equation? If the coefficient is the cost per hour or the slope, the y-intercept represents what? That's the y. I want to know the y-intercept. So if we look back at our equations here, So it'd be this right here, the 100 and the 175. What does that represent? It is the y-intercept. Let's go back to this one. Funkytown charges $100 for setup. Steven Solid Sounds charges $175 for equipment. So what can we say that that y-intercept is representing? Maybe additional costs, startup costs, deposit, something that you have to put down first before they will start playing for you. So I'm going to put up here start up costs. And it depends on the type of scenario that you're talking about, whether or not you're using the words startup or deposit or investment, those types of things. Like, what is the number that you're starting at, and then where are you going from there? For instance, yesterday in one of our videos, they deposited $10 into the account, and then they were saving so much money each month. So that $10 was your startup cost or your y-intercept. For what number of hours do more than one company have the same cost? Well, if we go back to our chart, that's very easy to see. We've already identified that. At 5 hours, Ted Tunes and Funkytown cost $300. So I'm going to put here 5 hours, Ted's Tunes, and Funkytown equals $300. So which company would you recommend to your committee? I'm going to give you just a moment to talk with your group to figure out which company you would recommend and why. All right, after some deliberations here, we have been able to figure out which company we would recommend to the committee and why. So, someone please tell me when they would recommend TED. 1 to 4 hours. Okay. Let's go back and look real quick here. Now, we said that 5 hours, Ted's in Funkytown is the same, right? So, I would probably pick Ted for 5 hours also. Like, that's a possibility, right? 1 to 4, definitely. 5 hours, possible, right? So I can write that is that I would pick Ted if my hours were less than or equal to 5. Now, how about we come over here to Stephen's solid sounds? We're going to do Stephen next. So if we look at Stephen's, when are we going to pick him? 8 through 10 hours. 8 through 10. That looks about right. So we're going to pick Stephen if our hours are greater than or equal to 8 hours. Now, Funkytown is that one that has stayed in the middle the whole entire way. When we look at our graph, Funkytown's in the middle here, and it's in the middle here. Something happens right here in the middle of our graph, though, that if I was able to widen it out, we could really, really see what's going on. And in our table, let's take a look. Change my color real quick. In our table, we said that Funkytown we could use for 5 hours. Well, 6 hours is the best deal out of these 3, and 7 hours is the best deal out of these 3. When we get to 8 hours, we're back to Stevens. So we're going to use Funkytown for either 5, 6, or 7 hours time. So we can say that Funkytown is between 5 and 7 hours. That 5 hours is just your personal preference because it costs the same as Ted's. Okay, so it's just depending on if you want Ted or if you want to get funky. Now, I would like for you and your table group to answer the following two questions. Suppose the DJ will be working for 4.5 hours. What is the cost of each company and which would be the best? Suppose the committee only has $450 to spend on the DJ. How long would each DJ be able to play and which company is the best deal? Hopefully you see a theme here. We're trying to figure out what is going to get us the most bang for our buck. We want to spend the least amount of money but get the most out of it. Okay? So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to work with your group and come up with the answers to these, and then we will check them over. Okay, we've had a few minutes to decipher the answers to the questions here. I am going to, there we go. I have a new chart here that's got the half hours in it. So suppose the DJ will be working for 4.5 hours. What is the cost of each company and which would be the best? So for 4.5 hours, how much is Ted's Tunes? For Funky Town and for Steven's Solid Sounds? 310. So obviously, if we're going to have a dance for 4.5 hours, we would pick Ted's Tunes for $270. That one was quite simple. Suppose the committee only has $450 to spend on the DJ. How long would each DJ be able to play for the amount of money, and which company would be the best deal? So how long can Ted play for $450? 7.5 hours, exactly $450. How much can Funky Town play for $450? 8.5 hours. And how much can Steven play for $450? 9.5 is 460. But if we go back to our other chart, here, 9 hours is $445 for Steven. So Steven's Solid Sounds would be our best deal at 9 hours for $445. So that's who I would pick here if we only had $450 to spend. We would get the most out of our money. Your homework this evening. You'll need to copy this down because I don't have it on a worksheet. Your homework this evening. If price or cost is a factor for a company to stay in business, how are the other two companies still thriving if they weren't the best to recommend to your committee? Remember that we said that the number of hours that you want is, the cost is dependent upon the number of hours that we want the DJ for. But in our economy today, we've seen that a lot of businesses have gone out of business because they don't have enough clients. Maybe they can't offer the best price or the best deal out there. So if you're not offering the best deal, how are you still in business? So this is not necessarily just a math question, but I want you to use math to help you figure out the answer. But I want you to think globally and what's going on in our economy today, and how does this affect you? How does this affect small businesses? And what are these other businesses doing to keep their clients even if they're not necessarily the lowest price? If you have any questions this evening, please feel free to send me an email, and I look forward to seeing you in